Worse, a weapon on this design risked killing its own bomber crew for no strategic gain whatsoever. By the summer of 1944, the physicist Seth Nettermeyer and later the Nobel laureate John von Neumann had co-dot Nagasaki August 9, 1945, 11:22 in the morning. Above the Urakami Valley, a Boeing B-29 named Bockscar banks awkwardly, heavy with a cargo it was never meant to carry twice. The primary target, Kokura, lies hidden beneath cloud and smoke from a firebombing raid the day before. The crew have burned through their fuel reserves searching for a gap in the sky. Now, with barely enough petrol to reach an emergency airfield, they turn towards the secondary target. Through a break in the clouds, the bombardier catches sight of the Mitsubishi armaments works threading the valley floor. He has seconds, not minutes, to decide. At 11:02, a device roughly the size and shape of an oil drum falls from the aircraft's belly. It takes 43 seconds to reach its detonation altitude of around 500 meters above the city. What happens next will end a war, open a new and terrifying chapter of human history, and remain, more than 3/4 of a century later, one of only 2 occasions on which a nuclear weapon has been used against people. This is the story of Fat Man, the second bomb, the one people forget. Everyone remembers Hiroshima. Little Boy, the uranium gun-type weapon, holds the grim distinction of being first. But Fat Man was different in almost every way that mattered. Different in design, different in physics, different in the sheer improbability that it worked at all on the first real attempt. It represented a gamble so audacious that the men who built it were not entirely certain, until the moment of detonation, that it would function as intended. Understanding why matters, because Fat Man's story is not simply an epilogue to Hiroshima. It is the story of a parallel, riskier, and in many ways more consequential path to the same terrible destination, one that would define nuclear weapons design for the rest of the 20th century. By the summer of 1945, the United States found itself facing a problem that seemed, on paper, almost impossible to solve. American scientists working on the Manhattan Project had 2 potential paths to an atomic weapon, and neither was straightforward. The first used uranium-235, an isotope so difficult to separate from its more common cousin, uranium-238, that entire cities had been built in secret simply to extract enough of it. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, consumed as much electricity as a mid-sized American city, running vast cascades of equipment around the clock to produce, over more than 2 years, enough uranium-235 for a single weapon. There was so little confidence surrounding the process, and such certainty in the underlying physics of a uranium gun-type design, that Little Boy was never even tested before it was used in combat. Plutonium offered an alternative, produced far more efficiently in nuclear reactors at Hanford, Washington. But plutonium came with a problem that very nearly derailed the entire program. The simple gun-type approach that worked for uranium, firing one subcritical mass into another down a metal barrel, would not work for plutonium. The isotope produced in reactors, plutonium-240, contaminated the more useful plutonium-239 and underwent spontaneous fission at a rate that made the gun method dangerous to the point of uselessness. Fire 2 masses together too slowly, and the weapon would not achieve a proper explosive yield. It would fizzle, a pre-detonation that scientists at Los Alamos referred to, with characteristic understatement, as a fizzle yield, convinced the Manhattan Project's leadership that an entirely different mechanism was needed. Rather than slamming 2 pieces of plutonium together, the new approach would need to squeeze a single subcritical sphere of the metal from every direction simultaneously, compressing it so rapidly and so evenly that it would pass through criticality in millionths of a second. It was, on the face of it, an engineering nightmare. The margin for error was vanishingly small. If the compression was not close to perfectly symmetrical, the core would simply squirt out sideways rather than compress, Again, a fizzle, and possibly a catastrophic failure on the runway. Solving that problem fell to the scientists and engineers gathered at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico, under the scientific direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer, working alongside ordnance specialists and explosives experts recruited from across American industry and academia. What they eventually built has become one of the most studied objects in the history of applied physics, and its outline, though not its most sensitive engineering secrets, many of which remain classified to this day, is now a matter of open historical record. At its heart sat a plutonium core roughly the size of an orange or a small grapefruit, weighing little more than 6 kilograms, encased within a dense shell of natural uranium, acting as a tamper to reflect neutrons back into the reacting core and briefly hold it together under its own inertia. Surrounding this assembly was an outer sphere of conventional high explosive, cast and machined into dozens of separate charges, each shaped with extraordinary precision. The purpose of this arrangement was to convert what would ordinarily be a ragged, uneven explosive shock wave into something closer to a perfectly uniform, inward-collapsing sphere, rather like transforming the splash of a stone dropped into a pond into a wave that converges, instead, on a single point from every direction at once. Detonators fitted around the explosive's outer surface had to fire within a few tenths of a millionth of a second of one another, a discrepancy barely wider than the blink of an eye stretched across a million repetitions would have been enough to ruin the compression entirely. The complete assembly, nicknamed the Gadget during testing and Fat Man once weaponized, measured roughly 3.5 meters in length and 1.5 meters across at its widest point, bulbous and ungainly, giving rise to its nickname. A nod, reputedly, to Winston Churchill's rotund silhouette, though the story has never been definitively confirmed. Fully assembled, the weapon weighed around 4,670 kilograms, heavier by some margin than Little Boy, and its shape demanded a bomb bay considerably larger than anything previously fitted to an American aircraft. One of many reasons the B-29 Superfortress had to be extensively modified to carry it at all. Because no one could be entirely confident the implosion method would work, the decision was taken to test it. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of the Jornada del Muerto in New Mexico, the Trinity test detonated a device of near-identical design to Fat Man. The flash was reportedly visible from over 300 kilometers away. The resulting fireball briefly outshone the sun. It was, in the words of Oppenheimer himself, a moment that summoned an old line from Hindu scripture to mind, though for the purposes of this account, what matters is simpler and more concrete. The implosion method worked, and worked far more powerfully than many at Los Alamos had dared hope. If you're finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It costs nothing and makes a real difference to the channel. Fat Man's combat history is mercifully, and, unlike Little Boy's, a matter of a single use. 3 weeks after Trinity, following Hiroshima's destruction on August 6th and Japan's continued refusal to surrender unconditionally, the weapon was flown from Tinian Island in the Mariana Chain towards Kokura, then diverted to Nagasaki when weather and smoke obscured the primary target. Detonating at an altitude chosen to maximize blast damage while limiting the crater and resultant fallout, the explosion released energy equivalent to approximately 21,000 tons of TNT, noticeably more powerful than Little Boy's roughly 15 kilotons, despite Fat Man's more compact plutonium core. Hilly terrain around Nagasaki, ironically, confined much of the blast within the Urakami Valley, sparing parts of the wider city that a flatter landscape would not have protected, even as it devastated everything within that narrow corridor. Estimates of the dead vary considerably, and historians are honest about why. Record-keeping in the chaos of wartime Japan was imperfect, and deaths from radiation sickness, burns, and related causes continued for months and years afterwards. Figures commonly cited range between 35,000 and 70,000 killed by the end of 1945, with total casualties, including the injured, considerably higher. What is not disputed is the psychological shockwave the bombing sent through the Japanese leadership. Combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria that same week, the destruction of a second city within 3 days convinced the emperor and his inner council that further resistance was untenable. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. It is worth pausing on the comparison with what else existed or was in development elsewhere in the world at the time. Nazi Germany's own nuclear program, hampered by resource shortages, scientific miscalculation, and the diversion of talent and material to other priorities, never progressed beyond laboratory-scale experiments with reactor design. No German weapon of remotely comparable destructive power ever neared completion. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, would not test its own atomic device, a design closely derived from captured intelligence on the American implosion method, incidentally, until 1949, 4 years after Fat Man. In that narrow window, the implosion technique pioneered at Los Alamos stood alone. It would go on to become the standard architecture for virtually every fission weapon built by every nuclear power, since uranium gun-type designs like Little Boy having been judged too wasteful of scarce material and too limited in yield for further development. In that sense, Fat Man, not Little Boy, is the true technological ancestor of the modern nuclear arsenal. The legacy of that single detonation over Nagasaki is difficult to summarize without either understating or overstating its significance, and honest historians tend to resist doing either. It did not, by itself, end the Second World War. The causes of Japan's surrender remain debated among scholars, with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria cited by some as at least as decisive a factor as the bombings themselves. What is clear is that the war did end within days, that an invasion of the Japanese home islands, one that could plausibly have cost hundreds of thousands more lives on both sides, never took place, and that the world entered the atomic age with a demonstrated, rather than theoretical understanding of what these weapons could do to a city and its people. Fat Man's implosion principle went on to inform decades of subsequent weapons design. Arms control negotiations were built around limiting or eliminating devices descended directly from its architecture, and the physical and medical consequences for Nagasaki survivors, the hibakusha, shaped Japanese and global attitudes towards nuclear weapons for generations. A casing nearly identical to the one used in the attack can today be viewed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, and at the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum, where the physical scars of the blast remain preserved as testimony. Return, for a moment, to that morning above the Urakami Valley, the cloud cover over Kokura, the dwindling fuel gauge, the seconds of hesitation before the bombardier found his gap in the smoke. It is tempting, with the benefit of 80 years hindsight, to see the events of August 9, 1945 as inevitable, the natural and unavoidable consequence of physics discovered, materials refined, and a war that had already claimed tens of millions of lives. But nothing about Fat Man was inevitable. The implosion method could have failed. The bombardier could have missed his window entirely and been forced to ditch a live nuclear weapon in the sea. The scientists at Los Alamos, gambling everything on a single full-scale test 3 weeks earlier, could easily have been wrong. They were not wrong. The gadget worked in the desert, and the weapon worked over Nagasaki, and in doing so it closed one chapter of human conflict and opened another that has not yet been closed. Every nuclear weapon built in the decades since war, American, Soviet, British, French, Chinese, and beyond, owes its basic architecture to the small, ungainly, deceptively simple device that fell from Bockscar's bomb bay on a Thursday morning in August. Little Boy proved that an atomic bomb could be built. Fat Man proved something more consequential still, that it could be built again, more powerfully, more efficiently, and, for better or for worse, repeatably. That, in the end, is why the second bomb still matters as much as the first. Not because it was more devastating in the moment, though in yield it was. Not because it ended the war single-handedly, because the historical record simply will not support so tidy a conclusion. It matters because it was the template. Every warhead built afterwards on every continent carries something of Fat Man's design inside it. The gadget in the desert and the bomb over Nagasaki were not the end of a story. They were the beginning of one that the world is still, 8 decades on, trying to find a way to finish.